Welcome to the Building Ventilation Summit. Created and hosted by AMCA Australia, the summit is designed to ignite an important national conversation regarding building ventilation and its role in managing the spread of COVID-19. We would like to thank our event partners for supporting the Building Ventilation Summit.
Okay, so it goes without saying that we've learned a bit over the past 2 years, but what does this mean for the future of building regulation and standards? How do we get from where we are now to where we need to be? And what should governments be doing? How should we be thinking about legal risk and regulatory compliance? These are just some of the issues that will be tackled in session 2 of today's summit. In this session, we're going to hear from 3 speakers that know a thing or two about regulation and reform, and who can draw upon recent experience dealing with combustible cladding to provide insights into possible next steps. First, Ted Baillieu, former Premier of Victoria, will draw upon his experience as Chair of the Cladding Task Force to discuss why a national coordinated approach is required to ventilation and air quality management. Next, building compliance expert and partner at Minter Ellison, Jeanette Barbaro, will discuss how we should be thinking about legal risk and regulatory compliance. And finally, Dr. Trevor Pisciotta, Executive Director at the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, will give us an update on how the Victorian Government is responding to the issue of COVID and ventilation. All 3 speakers will then be joined by Professor Lydia Morawska and Dr. Vit Garnis, who will provide their thoughts on the future of building standards and what regulation might look like. Now I'd like to just introduce the former Premier of Victoria, Ted Baillieu. Ted was a member of the Victorian Legislative Assembly from 1999 to 2014, serving as Premier and Minister for Arts from 2010 to 2013. For his service to the people and Parliament of Victoria, Ted was appointed an Officer of the Order of Australia in 2020. An architect by training, a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects, Adjunct Professor of Swinburne University, sorry, I've just lost my notes there. Drawing upon his unique mix of experience as well as his role as co-chair of the Victorian Government's Cladding Task Force, Ted has been a leading voice on the importance of ventilation and air quality management. I'd like to welcome Ted to tell us why the missing piece in our response to COVID is ventilation and why it's so critical.
Well, thanks very much, Ben, and thank you to AMCA. And this conference is about what I believe is desperately needed in this country and around the world, and also what's possible. And they're in 2 important concepts. And can I thank AMCA for the work they've done putting this summit together? And please don't underestimate how important this summit is. Now, I do have quite a few slides. I'm not going to dwell on them. They'll be available along with the other slide packs afterwards, but there's some important concepts I do want to touch on. And if we look over the last 5 or 10 years, there have been a couple of revelations about the built environment for the public. Firstly, there are an enormous number of contemporary buildings that are unsafe. Secondly, there are an enormous number of contemporary buildings that are unhealthy. Now, what do I mean by unsafe? Well, flammable cladding to start with, dodgy structural engineering, and we've seen that recently in Sydney, plumbing, glazing, stonework, lack of standards, monitoring, enforcement and accountability, other systemic defects, and that's on top of some of those that we've known for some time. And let's just briefly reflect on those. November 2014, the La Crosse fire in Melbourne, high-rise residential fire, a new concept for Australians, and tragically, a concept that's been repeated around the world. The Grenfell Tower from 2017, more than 70 people died in that horrific fire. And I visited Grenfell just a few weeks after. I visited as the co-chair of the Victorian Cladding Task Force at the time and met with many of the people involved. But it hasn't stopped there. This is a fire in Chile just a couple of years ago, suspected arson, horrific high-rise fire. And as recently as 48 hours ago in Essen in Germany, 50 apartments, more than 100 people involved. It is said, and I emphasise it is said, we're not yet certain, but this is supposedly started on a balcony, a timber balcony, and there supposedly was some EPS involved in the cladding. that fire swept through that building in a flash, and it's a reminder of the devastating effects of these fires around the world. So that's unsafe buildings. What about unhealthy buildings? And that's primarily what we're talking about at this summit. Poor indoor air quality, inadequate ventilation, HVAC systems that just aren't up to it, and the lack of standards that we've already heard about before. And over the years, the priorities in recent decades has been on energy savings rather than the health of occupants and the healthy buildings. Now, it's very difficult to take a photograph of an unhealthy building. It's difficult to take a photograph of unhealthy HVAC systems. And we move straight from the photographs we don't have to what are the consequences. And they're tragic. Fires around the world, tragic results from the pandemic. There's a loss of confidence and trust in the building industry. There's demands for bailouts and all the things that have gone with it. And our central business districts are being abandoned rapidly. What was the response in Victoria to the cladding situation? Well, I'd argue that it's actually been world leading, and it remains world leading. A task force was set up. The important thing, it was bipartisan, a reference group set up. It had a focus on public safety, and we had a strategy which should find the buildings, fix the buildings, fund the buildings, and deal with the future in the process, but essentially afterwards. And an independent agency to deal with it. Upfront funding, best practice. In the UK, by comparison, it's nearly 5 years since the Grenfell tragedy, and they still haven't finished their inquiry. As we speak, a building safety bill is going through the British Parliament. That's arguably being contested by all sorts of vested interests, and there's a long way to go in that. What's the current view of COVID in our country? Probably, you could argue, people are over COVID. People think it's in the past, but it's not. COVID's not over people. Our cities are still broken, and there's still a long way to go, and this issue is not going away. And if you look around the world, a lot of governments have turned a blind eye to air quality management and ventilation. We haven't had the leadership we needed on this issue, partly because you can't see that unhealthy air. It's a bit different from the fire, as I said. A lot of innocent parties have been left to carry the burden. And I guess the focus in the COVID response has been on other aspects, and we'll deal with that in a moment. But I do compliment the Victorian government. At least they've had a crack at doing something about schools with the deployment of air filters to most Victorian schools. What are the facts? We've learned a lot more this morning from Lydia and Vit and others and Norman. COVID is airborne. It took a while for the WHO to get there, but they got there, mostly because of Lydia's work. COVID is mostly spread by aerosols. It's mostly COVID transmission that's taking place indoors, and it's mostly in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, and it's poor air quality in buildings which poses a major public liability and OH air risk. And I want to emphasise as well, it's also about public transport, and some of the hesitations about people going back into our cities is about the hesitation of getting on public transport, and we can't divorce that from that fact. We've heard a lot about the WHO this morning. I'm not going to dwell on this slide, just to compliment Lydia on her work, and she has been world leading in that. And I want to make the point, and I'll come to it again later, it was inappropriate ventilation that led to the disasters in hotel quarantine in this country. And we saw this, the equivalent of this slide from Lydia as well. Aerosols linger, aerosols remain the problem in indoor situations. So what has been done in the COVID response? Well, worldwide there've really been 4 themes: isolation, monitoring, protection from transmission, and then prevention of transmission. And just glancing at these, the status of the various components, we're pretty familiar with the work on international borders and state borders and air travel limitations. We've seen isolation working in this country. On monitoring, yes, the COVID Safe app, good intentions, didn't quite get itself together. Contact tracing, we're all familiar with QR codes and reporting and testing, and that's important in managing a pandemic. But protection from transmission has had a lot of the focus, And that's masks, hand sanitisers, fomites, PPE, vaccination. That's had a lot of the focus. But when it comes to prevention of transmission, there are some gaps. And the fundamental gaps are about ventilation and air quality management, and particularly indoor air quality management. And I would argue, and others have argued as well, the management of indoor air quality is the missing piece of the COVID response jigsaw. And I think that's why this summit is so important to the well-being of Australians and on a broader scale as well around the world. The case for ventilation and AQM is historic, it's scientific, it's legal, it's powerful. As Lydia referred to it, Florence Nightingale was onto it 160 years ago. We've seen the Spanish flu consequences, and there's a wonderful book called The Ventilation of Public Buildings, Robert Boyle's book in 1923. Intimate detail about the design of buildings from 1923, and more recently, Joseph Allen and his partner Macomber, they're building healthy buildings out of Harvard. And just a very quick reflection, here's a little indicator of Harvard's comparison of Harvard's propositions for school reopenings to current DET, Department of Education and Training recommendations. And there are pretty significant gaps, even though Victoria has done much better than just about anybody. And there's some extracts from Robert Boyle's book from 1923. It's remarkable the detail that was gone into. Some classic thoughts preserved in those writings. The two best preservatives of health are sunlight and fresh air. Who'd disagree now? And Joseph Allen down the bottom, making the point that the air we breathe is the air that somebody else has been breathing before, and we ought to reflect on that as we go. So where are we at worldwide? Well, ventilation and air quality management is getting attention around the world now, mostly because of Lydia's work. The WHO are increasingly focusing on it. But in the UK, there's increased focus. Ireland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, Japan, you can go to some of these places now. It's mandatory to have air quality monitors in some of those restaurants and cafes and bars in some of those places, and in some states in the US. We haven't had that same focus yet in Australia. I think this is a part of making it happen in the future. The federal government has deferred this issue largely to the states. The states have taken different approaches. There isn't a uniform view about how that's going to operate. But again, I congratulate the Victorian government for at least having had a crack at it. And some industries are taking their own steps. I mean, I look around the room here, there are air filters here at this conference, and there are air filters in many doctor surgeries already. But this is an opportunity. It's more than just dealing with a problem we have now. This is, yes, an opportunity to slow the spread of COVID and other airborne viruses and bacteria. But it's also about reducing absenteeism. We'll hear a bit more about that tomorrow, I believe. It's about improving public health, saving lives, because people die because they have acquired transmissible viruses indoors. So it's about saving lives and saving resources. And it's also about mitigating liabilities and risk. And Vit was referring to some of this morning. And I think this is going to be an important driver into the future. My own view, it's inevitable. This is going to happen. It's going to happen indoors for buildings, and I believe it will happen as well for public transport. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I'm confident that it will happen. So who's going to move first? Who's going to be the driver is the critical question. Which government is going to move first, or is it going to be the industry or the health sector, the designers, the architects, the engineers? Is it the developers, the building owners, the property managers, the employers? There's some effort being made at the moment to insulate some of those groups from the consequences of some of this. I'm not sure that that's going to be something that works. But down the bottom there, you'll see lawyers and insurers and the courts. And it may well be, as it seems to be proving in the cladding sphere, that the lawyers, the insurers and the courts will have more to say about this than just about everybody in terms of driving change. Because when it comes to the insurers, their premiums in the UK, for instance, thousands of % increases. Their exclusions, massive exclusions. And once you start to increase premiums and start to make significant exclusions, then the weight of the responsibilities and the liabilities move up that table, and they fall on the building owners and the managers. And I think you'll probably hear a bit about that from Jeanette, our next speaker. Why hasn't it happened already? I think it's taken a while for everybody to recognise the problem. In this country, we've seen responsibilities divided between the states and territories and the Commonwealth. And I think that's a shame. There's been a bit of buck passing. There's a perception that this is a very costly exercise. Certainly cladding has led people to think that these interventions and building defects can be very expensive, and they are. But a lot of what we can do with air quality management isn't necessarily expensive. It's going to take some leadership, and it's going to take some understanding of what is possible. And we've heard some references to that this morning. And also, what are the broader benefits? And there are significant broader benefits. And in case you're in any doubt, New Zealand has had a combined unsafe and unhealthy building problem for more than 20 years. Their sick building syndrome, as it's called in New Zealand, led to the spread of deadly fungal spores. And the insurers spoke there, local government spoke there, and the New Zealand government had to step in. It's not finished yet, and there's recent publications which suggest the ongoing cost of dealing with the sick building syndrome in New Zealand alone, and compare that in economy and size and population, a cost of more than $45 billion already. A couple of points about that. That part of it can be expensive if it gets away, and it also takes a while to get over it. So the cladding component. So what's possible? And I don't expect you to read these slides. In green here, a list of things which are quick, low cost, easy things to do. Switch your HVAC systems to 100% fresh air. Most of us drive cars with a button in the car and it says fresh air or recycle. And I get into a lot of cars and I look just to see what people are doing. Most people have it on recycle because they want to stay warm. And they probably don't realise it's on recycle. If you can, put your HVAC systems, including in your car, on a fresh air. Increase the air changes per hour, some monitors, simple CO2 monitors. Yes, there are limitations about the efficacy of some of those monitors. I bought a couple in here this morning. A couple of them went off when we started talking closely over there. But you can get monitors, and if they go off and suggest there's a problem, that's a good thing, because then you'll go and check the systems. And obviously there are opportunities to install HEPA filters and do some assessment on rooms. There's lots of other low-cost things to do, simply opening windows and doors and unsealing hopper windows. And many hopper windows designed and installed years ago have been sealed by paint jobs. They can be opened up. There's lots to do on the easy side. There are other things to do which require a bit of support, maybe a bit of money, and that's updating your HVAC systems, monitoring those, doing some of the training for teachers, for staff, for students, and people in offices, office managers, and indeed acquainting people with the realities of air quality systems. And here's a question for all of those watching this summit. What do you personally know about the quality of air you're currently breathing? Secondly, who's responsible for the quality of air you're breathing? If you're at home, you probably know a bit, it's you. But if you're somewhere else, it's someone else. And do you know? Do they tell you what the quality of the air is? And I think there's a lot of room there for us to market the systems to the people who use the buildings and public transport. So in terms of a little more support and some work or cost, there is room for some modification of buildings, of standards, and as Vit was saying, some of it's going to take time, but there's a lot we can do. Communication's going to be a part of it, and elevating this issue to the national stage, I believe, is essential, and it needs to be reciprocated in the states, and we need to have some of those audits. We've heard before about dashboards from Vit, and I think we'll see a lot more of that. And I think we need a lot more guidance from those who have the responsibilities. So what's ahead? I think we'll be normalising this discussion in all areas. There'll be education and marketing campaigns. We'll have some different regulations and standards. We'll be testing new devices, new technology. We'll standardise dashboards in buildings and in public transport. I think the day will come when you step into a tram or a train or a bus, you look up and there's a dashboard on the ceiling, just as there is a dashboard about what the next stop is. And you'll see it in motor vehicles. They tend to get there. Those designers get there before anybody else. And you'll see a display in a car about air quality in cars. And I think we'll end up with vaccination passports for people, which we currently have, and we'll have ventilation passports for the built environment. And there's a very crude but simple example from a Belgian theatre, just a dashboard in the theatre giving an indication of what's going on. What are the drivers? Well, we've still got variants. We heard that from Norman. Winter is coming here. We should have been doing all of this through the summer months. We haven't. That's a shame. We've missed it. Healthcare, the pressure on healthcare, international experience will change. We'll watch that. The insurers and the legal side of it will be important. And industry, in my view, industry will drive this better than governments. And the allied benefits, the benefits of reduced absenteeism and reduced spread of all sorts of viruses and illnesses, I think will be part of it as well. The OHS side of it, I don't want to dwell on it any more than I already have, but it's important, and it is going to be an issue for building managers, employers, building owners across the board, and assessing risk, as we've heard from Vit, will be important. At the moment, most risk matrices don't run to air quality. I'm involved in some organisations, and surprise, surprise, I've encouraged them to put air quality on their risk management matrices, and that will happen. And I think we'll see some legal cases. There's one currently in New South Wales about hotel quarantine. I don't want to dwell on hotel quarantine, but there are some significant legal issues around that, and I think that is an indicator of where we're heading. There'll be some legal cases, and there will be some important steps taken. How do we get there? Lydia some time ago called for a paradigm shift. I think she's right. We need a national task force on air quality management, and we need to put public health up there as a built environment priority, just as we did with flammable cladding. And we need some national leadership, and we need some budget commitments. And I think we're going to see, as I said, risk management profiling across the corporate sector. And I flag, as we've flagged and seen, beware the vested interests. What we're seeing in the UK is vested interests probably seeking to protect themselves rather than deal with the issue at hand. Keys to the success, in my view, a national leadership, either government or industry, but I think industry is going to get there first. A national task force, a dedicated reference group, make it bipartisan. That was key to what we were doing in Victoria. Make it about public health, and monitor, manage, market and modify as we go, because it's going to be a learning experience, and incentivise both the states and industry to innovate. A reference group, you can imagine who ought to be on that reference group, widely based. There are going to be some supply initiatives for some of the technology and equipment, and we'll need guidance notes for various occupancies and guidance notes for various users. They're important. And as far as goals go, as I said, vaccination passports for people, ventilation passports for buildings. Healthy buildings equals healthy people, and that gives us a chance of some success. We've already got digital passenger declarations officially in Australia. We will see something, I think, equivalent for buildings in the future. The mission, make our indoor spaces safe, be they buildings or public transport, and then show people they are safe so people have confidence about going into those buildings. Monitor them, manage them, market what we are doing, what the situation is, and modify as necessary. And we've got to do better than this. Casual Fridays, masks on everywhere, nobody knowing what they really do. We need to have people back in our CBDs, in our office buildings and in our central business districts in a confident way. And remember, unsafe buildings kill. We've seen that at Grenfell. But tragically, unhealthy buildings kill even more. And that ought to be the motivation for us to do more. Thanks again to AMCA for this conference. It is, as I said at the start, very important for the well-being of the future of all Australians. Thanks, Ben.
go that way. Okay, thank you, Ted. You promised a strong view and a strong message, and I don't think you could have a stronger view or message than that last slide. And can I also thank you for championing the issue. To get traction on things like this, you need to have champions, and Ted's definitely been that. Now I'd like to welcome partner at Minter Ellison, Jeanette Barbaro. Jeanette is a partner at Minter Ellison in the Project Infrastructure and Construction Group. In addition to managing construction disputes and project delivery risks, she leads the firm's National Building Regulation and Compliance team. This unique combination of expertise allows Jeanette to bring both an understanding of the technicalities of building regulation and compliance, as well as the industry dynamics to her work with governments, regulators, builders, consultants, developers and building owners. Jeanette has worked alongside government and regulators, and Ted and Trevor, regarding the challenges of identification and rectification of combustible cladding, helping to reduce fire safety risk and inform building industry reform. I'd like to now invite Jeanette to give us her thoughts on how we should be thinking about legal risk and regulatory compliance. Welcome, Jeanette.
Good morning, and thank you, Ben, for that introduction. It's not always a great thing to follow Ted, being such a charismatic speaker and with such worldly experience, and especially to talk about the law. However, it is necessary to talk about the law when we talk about clean air, safe air, and the quality of the buildings that we live in. So today, what I'd like to do is to start and give you a very brief overview of the current legal framework that we're all working within. Secondly, I'd like to share with you from a legal perspective the learnings from combustible cladding, how they are similar to this issue, how they differ from this issue. And then finally, I'd like to conclude with another forceful message about the case for reform, but this time not from a technical or from a safe perspective, but rather a pure legal perspective. So let's start with the current framework. There is a lot of information on the slides that have been provided in this pack, and I'm not going to address every word on every slide. What I'd like to do is to hope that many of you will take the slides away and give them a good read and think about the environment that we are all living, working and playing in, and what that means to how we do what we do, how we live, and also how we manage any risks that we may come across. So let's start first of all with an acknowledgement of the breadth of the legal risk that we're talking about. The number of different spaces that we work, live and play in is extraordinary. I've listed the key ones on this slide, but essentially we as a society spend a lot of time in buildings. And therefore, when we talk about what indoor quality is like in those buildings, we have to keep in mind that we spend a lot of time indoors, and that the way we live is very different to perhaps 100 years ago. We are very transitory. We move between these spaces, and others move between these spaces, exposing us to others' air and the infectious diseases that may carry. When we think about the risk, I think it falls into two buckets. First, there's the legal risk that arises for failing to avoid poor indoor air quality. Secondly, there's the risk that arises if you've actually contributed to that poor indoor quality. Now, I've listed on these slides ways that that can exist, and you'll see that the reasons are similar for both buckets. It may be that you actually don't have a ventilation system in your space or building at all, or that you failed to maintain it, or that the contractor that you've engaged to maintain it hasn't done so in a compliant or a fit-for-purpose way. We also have, though, the possibility that our ventilation systems may be sick. And they may be sick because they are already infected, or they may be sick because they're not fit for the purpose that we are talking about today. Let's pause, though, to think about what governs what we design, build and occupy today. And the starting point is a really important message. It's one that we all need to take away. Our regulatory system in this state, and in fact across Australia, is predicated on a fundamental principle that the buck stops and starts with the building owner. And that's not the building owner at the time it was built or the time a building was designed, that's the current building owner. So consequently, if there's an issue with the building, first and foremost, it is the problem of the building owner. To inform what building owners should do, and also what their contractors and designers should do, we have building laws and regulations. We don't have a lot of them in this space. Some will say we've got more than enough, but that depends on the problem you're trying to solve. And I'll come to that in due course. Secondly, we have occupancy permits, occupancy certificates in other states. These documents have long been ignored, and we saw in combustible cladding that that was actually a fact. Occupancy of buildings was taking place without regard to occupancy permits. And when we think about air quality, there's some really important information on occupancy permits that all building owners should be aware of. And that is the number of occupants that is suitable for that particular building. Thirdly, there is a lot of guidance out there, both domestically and internationally, but it's guidance only. And there's some really good guidance, but it's not binding. And therefore, we shouldn't assume that if we're getting designers and contractors to help us solve this problem, that they will be bound to follow that guidance. The only way that they'll be bound to follow it is if the contract that you join with them in says so. And of course, the devil is always in the detail. And when it comes to our regulatory framework, the devil is sitting in the scope of our contractual obligations. Quite often, we don't necessarily specify what we're expecting from the mechanical ventilation system other than what the standards require. But I wonder, going forward, now that we've lived with COVID for 2 years, whether residential buildings, commercial towers, will be more astute in their negotiations and require the scope to specifically deal with air quality in more fundamental ways than simply relying on the building code and the standards that we know. And we should also bear in mind that there are a whole lot of building spaces that are exempt from the building laws, particularly existing buildings where works are being done. So the framework provides some guidance, but it is not a complete solution at the moment. The next few slides capture the responsibilities that apply depending on what hat you wear. So if you're a building owner or the owner of common property, and I say this because ventilation systems in high-rise buildings or high-density buildings are often common property, there are various obligations you need to be aware of. And they are not just building regulations, but also responsibilities as the occupier and owner of the building, and depending on who's occupying that building or you are allowed to occupy in that building, there may be a duty of care that arises as well. And if you're a landlord, your lease terms add additional burdens to you, as do various acts like the Residential Tenancy Act. So the framework in this state, which is mirrored in other states, for responsibility for owners of actual buildings or of common property or in their capacity as landlords, is actually quite onerous. And there is one particular aspect of that burden that is not well defined in this country, and that is the obligation to ensure that the building is fit for purpose. Now, there have been some recent cases that help us understand what those words mean if they are not properly identified in a contract, but we are still far away from understanding what that means in the context of clean air indoors. There are obligations that we impose on tenants, again, very similar to landlords, and of course, obligations on employers. And these are the obligations that have been most spoken about when it comes to COVID. We have heard for the last 2 years what employees' rights are, what employers should be doing, and we have focused on this issue from an OH&S legal perspective, and of course relied very heavily on workers' compensation schemes. But we've also relied upon support from government and for employers with respect to sick leave. So when we have thought about COVID, we've done really well in the last 2 years to focus on the issue from a health perspective and from a getting sick perspective. This conversation today is about paring it back to the environments we lived in and avoiding that risk altogether by changing that built environment that we work, play or live in. Many of you that are tuning in today will be contractors, consultants of various types, designers, and no doubt be thinking about your potential liability. Well, here's the good news. You'll see on this slide there are various ways that you may be responsible, but unless your scope requires you to do something other than comply with the building code and the standard, there's not much else that you're legally required to do. Now, that means that we come back to the devil being in the detail, and that is the scope of your contracts. So if you are designing new, building new, look to scope to understand what your obligations are for delivering a safe building, because they may be more than just the building code and the standards. If there's a fit for purpose obligation, be on notice that what that means may be something more than simply complying with the code and the standards. More importantly, if you are involved in maintenance or you're involved in troubleshooting the air quality issue, think about whether you've got the right expertise to do so. Because if you don't and you overcommit, the sorts of legal risks that I've identified on this slide become real legal risks for you all. And then finally, the last group that need to be concerned about responsibility are the manufacturers and suppliers of all of the products that we have seen enter the market in the last 2 years, or that have now been promoted as solutions. There are some great products out there, but one of the lessons learnt from combustible cladding was that not all products are the same, and that representations are often made about their ability to satisfy outcomes, and they may not do so. Insurance is an interesting issue. There is a lot of information on this slide for you to take away. There is a really key issue here. When it comes to building compliance and your insurances, whatever they may be, largely PI, kicking in, much like combustible cladding, unless there is an event that damages that property, your insurance will not kick in to cover the costs of fixing any ventilation problem that you have. Now, that's slightly different if your consultant has caused the problem in breach of their obligations and their PI policy may respond. But as a building owner, you can't simply investigate your ventilation system, figure out that there's an air quality issue with your building, and then ask your insurer to pay. Insurance policies won't respond in those circumstances. And that's the same lived experience that many building owners had with respect to combustible cladding, where there hadn't been a fire. There are a couple of cases that I've added in here to show you that historically this is a real issue. This particular one is a Supreme Court of New South Wales decision where the standards were complied with, but they weren't fit for purpose because it was an abattoir and it was understood that there were gases that were coming from the animals that they were dealing with, and the ventilation in the area that they were working in was insufficient. It resulted in a breach of duty of care owed by the employer to their employees and an award of damages. And there's an interesting case at the moment playing out in the courts in the US concerning a ventilation product, and it's actually the subject of a class action. Again, this is not an unrealistic expectation, even for Australia. If there are products out there that are being sold as the be-all and end-all solution and they don't perform, class actions will be what people resort to in order to seek compensation. Okay, so let's have a look at the gap analysis here because it's absolutely important. The first is that we've got these regulations, we've got these standards, but they're really, as you would have heard already from others this morning, they're really about design and operational maintenance, and they provide minimum standards and they don't necessarily respond to the health issue. However, that means that there is a gap for which we have to rely on the courts to fill. We can't simply say you've not met this standard and therefore my building doesn't comply or your work doesn't comply. And that leaves it in the hands of the courts to determine whether or not a duty of care has been breached or whether there's been a misrepresentation about what your work or the work of others was going to deliver. More importantly, these standards that we so heavily rely on were last amended 12 years ago. Now, if you think about what's happened in the world in the last 12 years, you have to start to wonder whether there is now a gap between what they were intended to do back then and what we now need them to do today. And that alone may be the reason why we focus on the quality and the effectiveness of the standards that we're relying upon, not just in relation to ventilation, but in the innovative changes that have occurred in the last 12 years. A summary of the gap analysis is on this slide for you to take away, but I think the most important takeaway here is that absent WorkSafe enforcement, there is not a lot for our building regulator to rely on, because if a building is built in conformance with the current standard, then it is compliant. But we understand that that standard doesn't respond to giving us the air quality that we need to minimise the transmission of airborne contagions like COVID. Learnings from the past. When I first paused to think about this, I thought, well, this sounds very similar to combustible cladding. It affects a whole lot of buildings, and I've listed the main ones there. You can't see it, so if you can't see it, you can't get hurt, very much like combustible cladding. If there's no fire, there's no problem. But it took a fire to spur action. It took a fire at La Crosse, and then we became complacent, and then it took a fire at Grenfell for us to really spur into action and say, hold on, something needs to change. I'm hoping that we don't have to wait for that to happen with respect to building quality and air quality. Very much like combustible cladding, there is a wide field of opinions and a wide field of solutions. And it's almost near impossible for consumers and building owners to navigate that and work out what is right and what is wrong. Some guidance would be essential, I would have thought. There is this lag, I think, as a legal practitioner, lag with innovation, lag with the changes in the way that we have been building in the last 20 years, why we build and how we use our spaces. And that of itself is cause to, I think, pause to look to see whether we need something more than the standard that we currently have. And of course, if we can't see it, everyone assumes zero risk, exactly like combustible cladding. No fire, not a problem. Interestingly enough, the issues continue to share similarities because there's actually no one-way, same-way solution like there wasn't for combustible cladding. Every building is going to be unique. And the solution will be multifaceted. It will require multiple disciplines. Ultimately, at the end of the day, architecture needs to coordinate with ventilation engineers. They need to coordinate also with air quality experts. And underpinning all of that, as we had with combustible cladding, education was necessary. Education of consumers about what products they could safely use, education about who they should be using. And again, much like combustible cladding, most of the risk often sits with those who can't afford to pay, and this is tricky to unlock. So with air quality, though, we've got some additional problems. We're in uncharted waters, we know that. We've lived the last 2 years together. But the biggest challenge is you can't set and forget. With combustible cladding, you can remove the panels, put an uncombustible cladding in, and you've dealt with it. With air quality, you can make all the tweaks you can today, but you can't forget about it tomorrow. It's not static in the way we use the buildings, not static in the way who comes into buildings. All of these will no doubt require ongoing maintenance, ongoing resetting. And those spaces can't be controlled. We can't control how people behave. We can't control if people are going to put a cupboard in front of a vent. And so we need to factor that into any solution. Similarly, government support and employer support has assisted in the short term. But in the long term, if we don't do something, we'll see a continued strain on labour resources, on the workers' compensation scheme, our healthcare system, and of course, we still don't know what long COVID is going to pose for us. So a long-term and a short-term perspective. The short term is, of course, much like combustible cladding. Avoidance is key, which therefore requires us to be proactive and not reactive. So in the absence of the appropriate standards. We have to rely on the building code and the building professionals to guide us, but some guidance outside that is absolutely critical. And we'll hear about the work that Trevor's team's been doing in that regard. As I said, education's absolutely fundamental, but it's not just of building owners and employers and tenants and landlords, but it's also of consultants. Each of you that are listening in who are experts in this area or in a part of this area, re-education, better education will be a part of the solution. And then finally, educating consumers, because there's lots that we can do, as we heard from Ted, day to day to minimise risk. Having clarity about who the right experts are is essential, and making sure that they're accountable is also essential. In the long term though, indoor quality standards would be the ideal, because they would set a new bar against which we work. And they would focus on infection control, which is something that, to a large degree, our current standards don't currently do. To have a dedicated state or national body would be ideal. A national solution is always what lawyers champion when it comes to building compliance. If that's not possible, then a state leading the way in the way that Victoria did with combustible cladding of itself would be tremendous. And then finally, I wonder whether the essential safety measures that we have legislated for could be extended in some very interesting ways to mechanical ventilation systems to improve in the long term the ongoing maintenance obligations and the ongoing resetting as circumstances change. So the case, to sum up, for reform from a legal perspective. The first is having specific guidelines and standards in the short term and the long term drives certainty and consistency. Very necessary for managing and defining legal risk. Secondly, we should compel management of the risk, firstly in the hand of building owners. And the way to do that is through standards that respond to the risk. Thirdly, having standards that respond to the risk actually tell people what they need to do. And they don't leave it to individual experts to provide an individualised solution that may be inconsistent with what the rest of the industry is doing. It sets the bar for the outcomes and objectives, particularly with respect to any legal action, and it also informs what is fit for purpose. At the end of the day, the more definition we can give to that concept, the better it is for the management of legal risk. And then finally, what it does is it sets market expectation. It allows us to differentiate those who comply from those who don't, and what a great way it would be to bring people back into the City of Melbourne if business could tell their patrons, actually, we're following the guidelines and our space at the moment is safe. Food for thought. Thank you all, and I look forward to further conversing about this in the panel session shortly.
Thank you, Jeanette. And I know, certainly speaking to a lot of our members, that understanding where the legal risk lies during a time of uncertainty is something that it definitely needs discussion, and we're very grateful to have you here today, and grateful too that you've agreed to moderate our panel in just a little while. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Trevor Pisciotta, Executive Director of the Department Environment, Land, Water and Planning Building Division. In this role, Trevor is the Head of Policy for the Victorian Government in relation to building, plumbing and architecture industries. Working closely with Ted and Jeanette, he played a key role in the Victorian Government's response to the issue of combustible cladding, a bit of a theme here during this panel, establishing the Victorian Cladding Task Force and Cladding Safety Victoria. More recently, and I guess pertinently for today, Trevor is Chair of the Victorian Government's Ventilation Technical Advisory Panel, which has been established to provide advice on ventilation in high-risk settings and guidance to assist business and industry respond to the unique challenges posed by COVID. Can I also just take this opportunity to again thank the Victorian Government for their support of the event today, which really just speaks to, or is an extension of, the leadership role that they're playing when raising awareness around the importance of ventilation and indoor air quality. It's great to have you here today, Trevor, and we're looking forward to hearing a little bit more about what the Victorian Government's doing in response to the issue.
Thanks so much, Ben, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here. Just on what Ben just mentioned, enormously proud that the Victorian Government is sponsoring this event. As Ted said, we can't, I think, overstate how important it is to hold events like this and raise the awareness amongst this key audience around the importance of building ventilation. And I'd like to thank my colleagues in the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions who facilitated the sponsorship of today's event. So as Ben said, what I'm going to do today is just talk through a little bit about what the Victorian Government has been doing in the ventilation space in the context of COVID-19. And most of this is actually not in the regulatory space. It's around practical mitigations and guidance, but really keen in the panel discussion to get into some of those broader regulatory issues with Jeanette and Ted and Lydia and Vit. So by way of context, and this kind of just picks up, I think, on a point that I heard Lydia make earlier today, it's important to note that ventilation's not a silver bullet. And so what I've got up on the screen here is just the what people may recognise, the hierarchy of public health controls, and it goes through the different kind of interventions for mitigating the risk. This is from a Department of Health document. So we've got elimination at the top, staying home if you're unwell, substitution, working from home, if possible, where that's appropriate. You've then got engineering controls, which includes ventilation, and then below that, management and personal protective equipment. So all of this is just to say that, as I said, ventilation is not a silver bullet. It's one of the interventions we can put in place to mitigate the risk of COVID-19 spread. And so in that context, the Victorian Government's approach to this issue has been about empowering building owners and operators and occupants with information to enable them to make informed decisions to improve their ventilation as a means of mitigating the risk of COVID-19 spread. And what I want to do today is just talk through a little bit about how we've gone about that. So it goes without saying, we've heard time and again this morning, particularly in the first session, that poor ventilation contributes to the spread of COVID-19. And so the Victorian Government has recognised this and is seeking to provide a consistent and coordinated approach across government to develop specific mitigations for government settings. So, you know, for want of a better term, getting our own house in order where we own and operate the asset, but also to guide efforts in private settings, particularly in what we might call public spaces that are nonetheless privately owned. So last year, the Deputy Premier announced significant investments to support safe ventilation in school settings. People will probably be well aware of the rollout of 51,000 air filtration units to schools, as well as other works, but also the establishment of the Ventilation Technical Advisory Panel to drive the delivery of the Safe Building Ventilation Program. So that program was established in October. It's coordinated by my department, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, working closely with the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, who lean into the industry side of things and have worked really closely with industry, including bodies such as AMCA over the last 2 years as we've navigated the challenges of COVID. And the program seeks to provide priority advice across 3 key perspectives. So one is delivering critical advice for safe ventilation settings. That's the kind of core work of the Technical Advisory Panel. Then looking at what support might be needed for local industry and what opportunities might arise from ventilation work. And finally, a range of communications activities. So as I think Jeanette touched on just before, guidance and education are critical in this space, and there's an opportunity here to be getting key messages out. In terms of who sits on the Technical Advisory Panel, as Ben said, I'm the chair of the panel. But thankfully, there's people who know a lot more about ventilation than me on there. So the panel includes a range of experts from across relevant fields such as fluid dynamics, mechanical engineering, hydrodynamics and occupational health. We've also got quite extensive membership from the Department of Health, including a Deputy Chief Health Officer and an occupational health physician. We've got the State Building Surveyor from the Victorian Building Authority, Andrew Cellini, who'll be known to many of you, as well as departmental asset managers. So essentially those parts of the Victorian government that own and operate assets that we are keen to look at from a ventilation point of view. And then we have technical consultants who attend from time to time as needed to provide advice. In terms of how we approach the task, and I was reflecting on this with Jeanette a little bit earlier, one of the things that was really challenging when confronting the issue of building ventilation is that the scale is just enormous. It's literally every space, for want of a better term, in Victoria. And so it was really clear that we needed to find a way to kind of prioritise our work and chunk it up into bite-sized chunks. And so the way we did that was through the development of a risk calculator that looks to calculate the probability of infection in different settings, assuming one infectious person is present. And this sounds very similar to some work that Lydia touched on in her discussion this morning. And so what this risk calculator does is really give a sense of the relative risk of spread of infection in different settings, and that then allows us to prioritise our work program, work out what are the spaces that we should be focusing on in terms of guidance and advice and mitigations. Importantly, the calculator is not a static tool. It continues to be updated as new data comes to hand. So particularly most recently, the tool's been updated to take on board the most recent information in relation to Omicron and the way in which it spreads in the environment. In terms of how we're rolling out our guidance, this is a kind of hierarchy of guidance that we look to. At the highest level, there's a set of principles, and I'd encourage people to have a look at this document. It's called an IPCAR guideline. That's the Infection Prevention Control Advice and Response Team at Department of Health, who've released a guideline on principles to reduce transmission of COVID-19 in community and workplace settings. And it sets a range of high-level principles around how you might mitigate COVID-19 spread through ventilation. At the next level down of specificity, we've got a ventilation website at coronavirus.vic.gov.au/ventilation that provides a range of key messages, essentially to anyone, to whether that be business owners or the community, around how you can improve ventilation in buildings. The next layer down, which I'll talk to in a little bit more detail in a moment, is some self-assessments with instructional diagrams, which go to some more specific built spaces and provide a series of questions and answers by which building owners or operators can go through and assess the adequacy of the ventilation that's currently in place in their building, and then identify what mitigations they might be able to take to improve the ventilation in those settings. And then finally, at the greatest level of kind of granularity, looking to develop targeted advice for specific settings or sectors where there is the greatest risk. So in terms of where that work program's up to, late last year we launched the ventilation website with a range of high-level materials, and there's it's linked into the kind of COVID-safe planning that there's an expectation of businesses to go through. This was moved into a separate ventilation page in January that provides some guidance around natural, mechanical and augmented ventilation systems, so augmented being the use of air scrubbers. And then most recently, the publication of these self-assessment guides that have been published for industry that provide easy and in most cases low-cost tips and strategies to improve natural ventilation, improve mechanical ventilation by maximising outside air. And Ted touched on some of these critical things around how we operate our HVAC systems in terms of maximising outside airflow, ensuring we're meeting adequate airflow per person per second, and so on. And then looking at how augmented ventilation, that is air scrubbers, can be used where required. The self-assessments that I spoke of have been released for 16 rooms or spaces, but in a lot of cases they might be relevant to similar spaces. So, but you can see what they are there. They were identified as some of the higher risk spaces with significant members of the public going through them and a high risk of COVID transmission. And so we've now released self-assessment guidance for each of those spaces. And just on the next slide, a little bit of a taste of what it looks like. This is an excerpt from a function room. And in this one, we're looking at a mechanical ventilation system, and it asks a series of questions around your capacity, how the ventilation operates, and your capacity to modify it, and then depending on the answer, takes you on to further guidance around what you might do. Each of the guides is divided into a natural ventilation and a mechanical ventilation section, depending on the predominant form of ventilation in the space, and is designed to be used essentially by, an engaged but not necessarily always expert audience. So we're thinking about building owners, in some cases business managers, in some cases facilities managers, and the like. In addition to this broad work, we're also doing work across what we might call sensitive settings, so settings that have been identified for priority consideration that are predominantly across government-owned spaces, and there's a list there. None of them, I think, will come as a surprise. There's been significant work done across many of these spaces already, including early childhood education and schools in particular, but a lot of work across the other settings as well that we are continuing to drive to ensure that government is really acting as an exemplar, as I think to draw the parallel we did in relation to combustible cladding and the removal of combustible cladding on government buildings, similarly ensuring that we are optimising ventilation, particularly with vulnerable cohorts in government-owned or operated settings. A key theme that has come up in, particularly in the self-assessment guides, and I know it was touched on this morning by Lydia in particular is around the use of HEPA filter units. We acknowledge, I think, certainly that they are not at the be-all and end-all for air quality, but that they do play a role in mitigation of COVID transmission risk, particularly where other improvements to ventilation might not be immediately possible. One of the things we've done is some working with our consultants is the development of some computational modelling and animation to show the utility of HEPA filters. And I'm just going to show a quick animation if I can. Here we go. That just is really simulating, just in an enclosed room, the difference between a one-sided naturally ventilated room where someone coughs in the middle without a HEPA unit and with a HEPA unit. And you can see on the right-hand side there that significantly less of the particles that are expelled remain in the area after 20 minutes where the HEPA unit is there. So it's just a quick little video, but I think it's a powerful demonstration of some of the benefits of HEPA filter units when appropriately located in a space. In terms of what next, obviously, and Ted touched on this, we are, even though it's still fairly warm today, we are heading out of the warmer weather towards winter. And I know Dr. Norman Swan mentioned this morning the possibility of a second Omicron wave in winter. We've certainly seen waves overseas in the cooler months. And so that is, I guess, something of concern. I mean, we certainly know that in the cooler months, particularly down here in Melbourne, we spend a lot of time indoors, and that just brings the importance of ventilation even more to the fore. So one of the challenges is what can we do between now and the onset of winter to try to put in place mitigations for improved ventilation, noting the significant challenges that businesses have faced due to COVID-19 generally. And that might be a topic we come back to in the panel discussion around the discussion of regulatory reform, because I think We also, as much as we can't overstate the challenge that we are collectively facing and the importance of building ventilation, we also can't ignore the reality of the society-wide challenge that everyone has faced over the last 2 years, and so the capacity of industry and business to absorb change and to, particularly to make significant capital investments, might simply not be there. To that end, I would just note, and this isn't in the slides because it was just announced yesterday, but as part of an announcement of some broader business support packages, including people may have seen entertainment and travel voucher schemes for metropolitan and regional Victoria. There was also an announcement of a $60 million ventilation voucher program, which includes matching grants of up to $5,000 and vouchers of up to $500 for businesses to improve their ventilation, to provide greater protections for their workforce and for customers, and to encourage customers back into spaces through those ventilation upgrades. In terms of opportunities, I think there's enormous opportunity, and one of the things I've really got from this morning's discussions have been looking at the ways in which focusing on ventilation can have benefits well beyond mitigation of COVID-19. Obviously, that's the focus at the moment. That's what's driving action right now. But many of the speakers today have spoken about not only other infection spread that can be mitigated through good ventilation, but also other benefits, the impacts of higher CO2 levels on cognition, exposure to particulate pollution and the like. So this is just a space that I think offers enormous opportunities if we can lean in and make some sensible changes. There's obviously also a potential for businesses, both service and manufacturing, with an increased focus on building ventilation. That creates an opportunity, it creates a market. And as always, I think we're keen to support Victorian businesses to take advantage of those opportunities. In terms of the work that we're doing in the Victorian Government, we continue to try to support businesses and industry to implement cost-effective solutions. We're continuing the whole of government Victorian work across the Victorian Government to ensure that government is an exemplar for mitigation strategies. And there's also work underway, and again, we might touch on this in the panel, with the Australian Building Codes Board and with my colleagues in other states around the adequacy of the current requirements in the National Construction Code, and whether there does need to be improvements in standards and requirements. So that was all I wanted to say today. Thanks so much, and looking forward to the panel conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor and Ted and Jeanette. And thank you again to the Victorian Government for their support of this event, but more particularly for their leadership on this issue. I know they have certainly been consulting with the AMCA and some of our other allied industry associations on this issue really closely, the technical advisory panel as well. So there's a lot of engagement with industry on the issue, and we thank them for that.